process. Without further ado, let me introduce the moderator for you for today's session. Adam Gelb is the director of the Public Safety Performance Project at the Pew Center on the States. He's been involved in crime control and prevention issues for the past 23 years as a journalist, a congressional aide, and a senior state government official. Adam began his career as a reporter covering crime and drugs for more than 4 years at the AJC, or the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He staffed the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee during negotiations and final passage of the 1994 Crime Act. And then from 1995 to 2000, he was instrumental in developing several nationally recognized anti-crime initiatives as the policy director for the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. Adam served as executive director of the Georgia Governor's Commission on Certainty in Sentencing from 2001 to 2003, where he helped achieve consensus on a new statewide sentencing structure and an innovative system of sentencing options for felony offenders in Georgia. Before joining Pew, he was vice president for programs at the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse. Adam graduated from the University of Virginia and earned a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. So without further ado, Adam Gelb.
Good morning, thank you. Appreciate the introduction. And it's terrific to see so many people in this dark ballroom on such a beautiful day to talk about prisons and sentencing and corrections. I think if we were in Texas, would you guys like have a retractable dome in here that we could let in some sunlight?
We can hold about 114,000 people. Even on a Texas, even on a day when Dallas Cowboys are playing right now, we could probably get it.
But the Jumbotron might block a little bit of the rays, right? So we're just going to kick right in here this morning. I'm going to throw some things at you, and then rather than doing the sort of the standard panel this morning where we'll do 2 presentations, I think we're going to try to have a more interactive discussion. It's a pleasure to be here with Jerry Madden, who has not only led the efforts in Texas to get a better public safety return on correction spending, but has really become, I call him the Pied Piper of sentencing and corrections reform around the country, and he is being recognized next week in Washington for that as one of Governing Magazine's Public Officials of the Year. So congratulations to Jerry. It's a real pleasure to be with him, and you're all... and also with Marc Levin, who, if you haven't met him yet, is just absolutely indefatigable advocate for this, too, as Jerry and they will describe Marc's central role in helping Texas get where they've gotten on this as well. Marc's a lawyer and doesn't act like a lawyer on these issues. He thinks much more practically than lawyers tend to on these issues. There are 1 in 100 adults in this country behind bars, right? Our project crunched that number a couple years ago when we saw the number approaching that. 2008 was the first year that was the case. In Georgia, the number is 1 in 70 adults are behind bars. That's in prison or jail, and that is the 4th highest incarceration rate of any state in the country. So 1 in 100 nationally, 1 in 70 behind bars here in Georgia. When you look at the broader correctional population, to people who are in prison, jail, and then on probation or parole, you get 1 in 31, or about 3%, a little over 3% of the adult population in the U.S. under some form of correctional supervision. In Georgia, the number is 1 in 13. 1 in 13 adults in this country are on some form of correctional control, and that's mostly due to a very high rate of supervision number of people on probation. That is a nation-leading number, second behind Georgia in the total rate of correctional control is Idaho at 1 in 18, and there's some reasons for that. We're fortunate to have Commissioner Owens here today, and he loves talking about how and why those numbers are the way they are. And Brian, we can engage in that a little bit later if you'd like. But it's really something else. But this state is number 1, if you will, when it comes to the extent of correctional control of its citizens. What's all that cost? About 25 years ago, when you added up the cost of prison, parole, and probation, it was about $150 million. Flash forward to today, it's about $1.1 billion, so almost a tenfold increase in the cost. And I think most people, certainly Representative Madden included, would say that would all be worth it if we got a really strong public safety return. And there's no question that here in Georgia and across the country, the expansion of incarceration has helped reduce the crime rate, no question at all. When you lock up career offenders, when you lock up violent people, that's what you have prisons for, and it certainly pays off. The issue is, at this point, have we locked up so many people? Has the net been cast so wide that we're sort of past the point of diminishing returns? And the answer seems to be yes. Some of the things that pop out are, for instance, that Georgia's prison population in, say, the past 10 years has gone up about 25%. It's now, well, actually, Brian, it was, you were saying it was 55,000. The number I'm looking at is 53. That was probably last week's number, right? So it's at 55,000. So the population in Georgia up 27%, or probably 30% since the end of the 90s. Crime is down 20%. Take a look, though, at New York. New York, its crime is down 29%. So New York has had a bigger crime drop over that period. But New York, instead of growing its prison population 27%, New York's prison population is down 19%. And there are actually 7 other states that have seen reductions in their incarceration rates and their crime rates at the same time. So trends like this are starting to raise questions in state legislatures across the country that focus on not just how do I demonstrate that I'm tough on crime, and the question of would more prisons reduce crime, but actually a much better question, which is what's the best way, what's the most cost-effective way, dollar for dollar, going forward to reduce crime? And so we have states all over the country that we're working with at Pew and that others at the Council of State Government Justice Center, the Vera Institute of Justice, a bunch of us are out there helping states in a bipartisan way ask and answer some of these questions. States from Kansas, Nevada, New Hampshire, all have tackled this issue, rolled up their sleeves, looked at their data, said, you know, are there some people in prison who either don't have to be there for public safety purposes, or are there some other alternatives that we could use for them, and often found some pretty dramatic solutions. Here in the South, Mississippi made some dramatic reforms in 2008, rolled back their requirement that all nonviolent offenders serve 85% back to 25%. Thousands of offenders, even in just the first year. Mississippi released over 3,000 nonviolent offenders significantly early, more than a year earlier than they would have been under other policies. So Mississippi did some dramatic things, not necessarily things that you know, we'd like to see or support, but nonetheless, Mississippi said, you know, this is something we can't afford. We think we can do better with less. South Carolina, we have a summary in the back of our comprehensive reforms that South Carolina just passed this year. Significant sentencing reforms. They increased some penalties for some offenses and reduced penalties for others, made a number of other changes to parole. Alabama has a process going on right now led by the Chief Justice, and we've just received requests from Governor Jindal in Louisiana to come in Louisiana and help them. Their session doesn't start till April, so we have a little time to try to get going in Louisiana and help them this session, but they're really trying to figure out how to make some changes in policy rather than just simply cutting programs and furloughing workers and things, that make some structural changes in their system as well. Texas is probably the best example of a state that made some dramatic changes, and with that, I just want to lead into hopefully a conversation here. I'm going to sit down and let Jerry and Marc talk about what happened in Texas in 2007. But first, before we get to the sort of the specifics of Texas, which we have a good chunk of time to spend on this morning, would really love to ask both of you about sort of the political environment here, which has really sort of changed dramatically over just really the past few years, and ask you the following question: why should conservatives support a close examination of prison spending? Jerry, can we start with you?
Thank you. For those of you who've heard my story and how I got involved in the corrections process all along, basically didn't start until January 2005 when my speaker calls me in and says, "You're chairman of corrections." All right. And I had at that time never done a corrections bill. I'd never done on the budgets of corrections. I had not visited a prison. I had no experience whatsoever in the area. So I said, as we all would do, I looked over at my speaker and I said, "Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the honor of being the chairman of the committee." And then I said to myself, well, God, why me? What did I do to deserve this? Because, it was not my background. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a single prison in my district. I'm an engineer by background. Where does that get you started? And then I think I made what probably was the most important question I've ever asked in my life is I turned around to him and I said, "Mr. Speaker, what do you want me to do?" And he gave me 8 words that basically are the 8 second most important words in my life after hearing my wife say yes and I do to the question of what do we do, and that was, don't build new prisons, they cost too much. Now that's a very conservative message to all of us. How much do your prisons cost? Well, I didn't know at the time. I didn't know where to start. But if you want a conservative message of where we're at in all of our areas that we deal with in legislatures, you ought to ask the question, well, how much do things cost and what are the alternatives? Now, as an engineer, I didn't go along that line yet. I just had this question and I said, well, what's my situation? And I found out quickly we had projections for large increases in prison populations. And as an engineer, I can recognize real quickly that I could draw this box called prisons. And I've just been told, don't build any more of those. You can't do that, okay? So what are my choices? Well, the choices are basically either you go into an overcrowding situation, which we'd already been under a court mandate and probably couldn't do that, or you open the doors and let them out, or you figure out some way to slow them down coming in. I mean, those are your real alternatives that you have. As an engineer, I guess I was lucky enough, smart enough to bring some people in that did have some great abilities, but didn't have any preconceived conditions of what they were doing. And I started looking around for help. I started looking around for, well, where else can I go and where else can I look that'll help me with this problem that I've got of don't build new prisons, they cost too much, and how do I control that aspect without being perceived as something radical or just doing some things that weren't smart that would destroy our primary responsibility, which is public safety. And in doing that, I looked, and obviously I found some national help from people like Adam and the Pew Foundation as they got involved with us as we went forward. I found our Council of State Governments Justice Center that I've gotten involved with. I found some resources going around. I found some state ones too. And it's a real good thing when you start asking questions and you find when you have two think tanks come in, one whose reputation is very conservative and the other one who's very liberal, and when they start telling you things on corrections policy, they were almost saying the same things. Get rid of the extremes on each end. They were telling you things that were almost all in the center, and that's when I got to meet this young lawyer that's sitting beside me, and that's Marc Levin, and Marc's just a great resource, and I think I'll let Marc do a little bit of answering the questions too on how does that fit with conservatives.
Well, thank you. I think that those are excellent points. I think as conservatives, we emphasize limited government, and we recognize public safety is one of those, I would say, few core roles of government. But it's that much more important then to hold criminal justice agencies accountable for their results for reducing recidivism and make sure that our system is truly effective. And so just like we talk about merit pay, we talk about teacher quality, accountability, and education, we ought to be just as demanding when it comes to corrections because it is so important. And I'm also reminded the Harris County District Attorney, which is Houston, said the law is the weakest form of social control. And she went on to talk about how she was brought up by her family to respect the law and just basic Ten Commandments type things. And so, the law, when you talk about, the goal, of course, is to change people's behavior. But when you look at something like reentry, people coming out of prison, the very high recidivism rates. Speaker Gingrich wrote a piece in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution several months ago that talked about the high rate of people returning to prison in Georgia. And the what you really see is you need the community, you need the family, those traditional elements in order to, so when people come out of prison, that they have an opportunity. One of the things we did in Texas is we enabled people to get occupational licenses who couldn't become a barber because they had a drug possession conviction, for example. We passed a bill so they could get a probationary license to enter those occupations. We're looking at relieving employers of negligent hiring liability when they hire ex-offenders. So I think those things are very conservative to get people away from being a burden on society and to being tax-paying productive citizens, which is our goal here, and law-abiding citizens.
Mark, we know that anybody that comes in your prison or jail systems, they get free room, free board, and free health care. Now, how many of us think that that's a constitutional requirement, and every one of them that shows up there, that's what they're going to get? Okay? Can we better use some of our taxpayer dollars some other places than providing particularly some of those people, not all of them, certainly we got to keep those that we're afraid of, that are violent, that we got to keep. But isn't it a better utilization of our money than providing them with free room, board, and health care for some of these other people and let them go out and work and provide and become taxpayers? That's part of the relevant system.
So listening to you guys talk, you're sort of making these statements and making them sound very rational and logical, right? But this has not always been the position of conservatives or liberals or otherwise, right? We had a long period there where it was sort of, all sort of rules of cost-benefit analysis or other was sort of tossed to the wind, and the courts in particular so had a blank check, right? There wasn't an offender that didn't belong in prison. That's why we had this massive explosion of imprisonment in this country. What do you think has changed to make this sort of logic or argument that you're making here more appealing to conservatives? Why do we have Grover Norquist speaking out on this, and David Keene, head of the American Conservative Union, Newt Gingrich writing op-eds? What's changed the dynamic here?
Well, I mean, some of it is simply the facts. I mean, the crime rate has gone down a lot over the last 20 years. Part of that's due to policing. CompStat, the data-driven policing Mayor Giuliani did in New York City that's been replicated in other urban areas. So there's many reasons for that. But that, the less obviously the public sees, and no doubt crime is still a problem, especially, and I saw some stories in the local news last night that I'd find it hard to repeat here. But nonetheless, I think I wanted to add also on my previous comment that the reason we actually initially got into this whole issue was one of our board members felt that the criminal justice system needs to be aligned more towards the victim and restitution, particularly for property offenses, rather than the prerogatives of the government. And that truly would be a small government approach to this issue. And in fact, when we looked at it in Texas, we found our probationers pay every year $46 million in victim restitution. Many of them, it's because they're holding a job, whereas those in prison pay less than $500,000 in Texas, and that includes fines, fees, and restitution, so virtually nothing. So that doesn't mean everyone should be on probation, nobody should be in prison, but it does mean that we need to look seriously. I mean, in this country, about a third of all restitution is actually collected that is ordered by a court. So, fundamentally, if a kid in my neighborhood steals something out of my garage, I want that thing back, and I'd like to see him get back on the right track. So it's kind of restoring back to those traditional principles in our criminal justice system is what really led our center. And I think when you look at all these different factors, you can really see that there are a lot of reasons why conservatives in particular should focus on this area.
I think also, Mark, this is a political statement from my politician friends. If you go out to meetings that you have and you go to either town halls or whatever you have, you can look at your audience and remember Adam's figures here talked about how many people are involved in the criminal justice system. And you can look out into your audience and you can ask the basic question, how many of you have had family members that have been involved in the criminal justice system? And if you go beyond that, ask them how many people that you went to school with have gotten into the criminal justice system in some way, or somebody that you've gone to church with, or other places, how many of them have gotten in there? And you'll see, if you ask them the question, if you have somebody that fits into those categories and ask them to raise their hand, there's a large number who will. A large number of all communities who have had people who have gotten involved in the criminal justice system in the wrong light. And then you ask them, well, what are those people? Were they really always just really bad people? Or were they people who made some really bad, dumb decisions and really made some bad mistakes in their life? and what's their core values of those people. And you'll find out that, yeah, oh yeah, there's some that are really bad. And I think we all can agree, those that are really bad, that we're afraid of, that the public should be afraid of, you lock them up and you throw away the key, because that's the best thing you can do with those people. But for a lot of those people, and you find out that it's probably well more than 70% that the family members or others will say they made some terrible decisions and some terrible choices. And I think one of the examples that we have out there we can look at is, you know, in Washington, they passed the Second Chance Act. It was President Bush who was the sponsor of and moved the Second Chance Act that said there are people who we have in our prisons and jails who truly have changed, who truly their mental processes or whatever it is that causes them to change their heart, they found religion, whatever it may be, that they are in fact different people, and that we as a Judeo-Christian nation do believe in some sort of redemption, some sort of set of beliefs that we as conservatives share, that says that somebody who's made a bad choice, who's made some really bad decisions, doesn't mean that we shouldn't give them at some stage an opportunity. Yeah, there's a payment for their crime. Yeah, there's a responsibility for public safety. Yeah, there's a responsibility for paying back victims. But there's also a place that says, you know, you can in fact be forgiven. You can in fact receive redemption, and that we are in fact in a position to give that as lawmakers, as representatives, as senators.
Thank you. Before we kick into some discussion about Texas, I just wanted to throw it open and see if there were any questions from folks about the political dynamic here in the changing landscape. Anybody want to hit either of these guys with a question about that? No? Okay. And for either of you, or maybe both, can you describe the background, sort of where Texas was in 2007 when the speaker came to you and said this?
Well, he actually came to me in 2005 when I was first appointed chairman, and started there. And where we were at, we had over almost 150,000 prisoners, which I didn't know at the time I became chairman. And we have about 450,000 people that are on probation of some type. And we had about 78,000 people that are on parole. You can figure out that's a pretty good percentage of your population. We have incarcerated pretty close to the same percentages that you all do. We had cost running about $38, $39 a day for each prisoner. We're spending right now about $18,000 a year for each prisoner that we have in the system. Your numbers are comparatively close to that. We're both notoriously cheap, our states are. We don't spend as much on it as some states do. There's a lot of states that spend a lot more of their dollars, but we're spending a significant part of your budget. It's probably, I would guess, in Georgia, like we have, it's about the fourth largest section of your budget. It's a critical factor that we had to deal with. So that's where we started. And I fortunately, as I said, I had the think tanks on both sides. So at least I had some people out there thinking about the process. And we also had a probation group that had some pretty good ideas, that they were being very progressive in their outlook on things that you could do in the front end to keep them from coming in. Because I quickly realized in Texas, my alternatives were really thin, because I will guarantee you in Texas, it's probably just like Georgia, one of your solutions is not open the door and let them out. And anybody think that that's a popular political position that you're going to be able to spend? I don't think so. I couldn't either. Okay, I wasn't going to try to do that. Now, when you get in and dig a little bit farther, you might be able to find that there's some tweaking you can do on that, but you know what it is. But so the thing I had to do was figure out, how can I slow them down coming in? And so we did a probation bill. I found an ally over in the Senate who's going to be up there with me in Washington next week receiving the award, and that's John Whitmire, because of the work that he'd done. He was our criminal justice chairman in the Senate side, and I found out, even though he was the other political party, that it became a bipartisan issue when we started talking about it. That it was something that it wasn't a political divide between parties generally in what we were doing. It was more of a, people just don't know it. I mean, how many of your legislators really know much about the prison systems? Not very many, a few, okay? And so we sort of had to take the lead in educating more of our people of what you could do. So I did it with the probation department, and John sent me a bill that was way too liberal. I couldn't pass it in the House. I knew it. I modified it substantially, got it through the House, and we came within one vote of passing it because the governor vetoed it. Best thing that ever happened to us. Because that required me then in the interim between our 2005, since we meet every other year, between our 2005 and 2007 session, it started me to ask the question, well, where can you intervene? Where can you break the cycle of people? Because, you know, we had in Texas the cycles, they leave prison, what do? They cycle back and come back in, right? You got a lot of that happening in Georgia. There are some that don't, okay? There are some that will never return to your prison system, okay? There are many that cycle back. How do you change that so that fewer of them come back? Because you're not going to get it. I mean, if one of these really bad people has completed their total 20-year sentence, they're going to come back. I mean, you know it. You could ask the question. You know they're a high-risk individual. You know they're going to be back. But a lot of them, how do you break that cycle? Where do you break it at? And I started looking at all of the places that I thought I could break the cycle, and started looking at legislation that might work in all of those, from changes on our parole system to changes in our in-prison activities and our treatment programs. I mean, it was ludicrous that we had, you know, alcoholics in there and weren't doing any alcoholic treatment program. It was ludicrous that when we didn't have we had people in there that were obviously drug addicts, that many of them weren't getting drug treatment. And we had, so that was some of the things we looked at. I mean, we looked at a whole bunch of other programs. We looked at the probation departments, and your probation structure is different than ours. The thing that I totally recommend to everybody is know your own state and know your own cycle, and know how then you can start getting in and intervening in that cycle. But I also looked at the kids in the education system. I mean, how many, and you get back into the juvenile system in particular here, but you get back and looking at those, that's the pathway. I mean, those kids are on their way. If you don't break their cycle with them, they're on their way, so you're going to be your next inmates that you have in your prison system. But look at also how do you do that in the schools, because there's lots of indicators in the school. Most prisoners have a very low education rate. They've dropped out. How do we change dropout rates so that kids stay involved? How do we keep that from happening? Where can we do the things in bullying and those when the kids first start showing signs of trouble in the schools? And I look back to parenting, because the key factor, if you ask one factor about a baby being born today and try to determine what's the likelihood of them going to be in prison, there's one key factor with mom or dad in your prison system. And that's the biggest number there is. If mom or dad were there, how do you break that cycle? And so I would suggest to all my legislative friends, look at all of those, because I read a book called The Tipping Point. If you haven't read it, I would highly advise looking at that, because I don't know of all the things we did in Texas, because we did a lot of them in 2007 when we started putting the teams together. I don't know which of those turned our cycle.
And you had in 2008, there were 2,600 revocations for probation for new offenses, but there were 3,700 revocations to prison in Georgia in 2008 for technical violations. Now that can be missing an appointment, it could be testing positive for drugs. So we strengthened in Texas these graduated sanctions. It's like disciplining a child. You don't wait till all these violations pile up. You do, each time there's a violation, you have a swift, sure, and commensurate response to that, and also positive incentives for exemplary behavior are very effective on probation. And so, you know, we did not look at sentencing, but I wouldn't tell you not to look at it. I mean, in Georgia, if you have more than an ounce of marijuana, you could go to prison for up to 10 years. If you have cocaine, first offense of an ounce is 2 to 15 years in prison. And you've got about 9,000 prisoners in Georgia for drug offenses. Now, we, you know, strongly advocate drug courts. We don't advocate, you know, decriminalizing drugs or anything like that. I think that we know drugs have a terrible impact both on the individual, the family, our neighborhoods, but certainly it's appropriate to distinguish between somebody who is an addict, who has a possession issue, versus somebody who's dealing drugs. And those are the people that we really need to get off the streets. But when it comes to those who just have an addiction, drug courts, and you've got 28 drug courts in Georgia, but I think there's room to add not only drug courts, but other problem-solving courts. Mental health courts have had very effective research indicating that they reduce recidivism. And so it's that judicial accountability that the offender has to report to the judge, attend treatment, meet all those conditions, or else they can be revoked to prison. So it's these things that really cost far less than prison that just simply having the capacity in these areas is so effective, so we don't send people to prison just because there's no other option.
Just a follow up on that really quick. In terms of the stakeholders, particularly judges and prosecutors, were you hearing actively from them at that point that, you know what, we are putting people in prison who we wouldn't necessarily want to put there, but we're doing that because we just simply don't believe that there are sufficient options in the community that will hold these folks accountable and set them on a straight path?
The judges in particular, Adam, have been deeply involved when we were doing the original bills on probation, that they had been actively involved and told us a lot of things that they had. And obviously different judges told us different things. You know, when you have the number of judges you have in this state, I would guarantee you they won't all tell you the same thing about what you ought to do. But we try to put together a consensus at least of what judges were recommending. We certainly listened to our district attorneys and what they were saying and some of their recommendations they have, because there's a lot of people out there with a lot of good ideas. Just it's a matter of having the ability then to pull them in to work on it. And when we failed after the 2005 bill on probation, what I did is I actually pulled together groups of people to work on specific parts of the areas of legislation. I pulled my think tank people in the room and basically told them they can't leave until they agreed on some of the things that were in our bill that would be acceptable to the governor that we could go back and do on another bill. I pulled my judges in to specifically talk about, well, what differently can we do on making sure we have enough funds for their specialty courts, for their drug courts, for their mental health courts, for their veterans courts, for the other types of things that are out there. We specifically worked with the mental health people and brought in a lot of people from the mental health area to talk about that, because reality is, guys, your prison's got a lot of people with mental health at least diagnoses, and some of them are there because you probably just don't have the right place to put the mental health offenders that are there. They're you know, if you're a sheriff, which is the first person you want to get out of your jail? It's the one who's disrupting your jail. Who do they want to move first to the prisons? They want to move the people with the mental illness problems, the mental health problems. So that was one of the things that we also found, was you could bring them into the room. You could bring in your departments, bring in your correction department for sure. I mean, in digging, I got a lot of cooperation once we started figuring out, because I asked the question, okay, if I'm going to do things differently, what are the things we need to do differently? And then you got to start asking the budgetary questions. You got to ask, how many of what do we need to do our job right? If we're going to do it correctly, if we're going to do everything that we need to do, what were those things, and how much are they going to cost me? Or are we in fact going to have an opposite side? Do we have one of the presenters earlier this morning talked about data, and I think it was Governor Wise talked about data. Do you have data that you can use? Because there was a lot of good data that we had that could show, if we did an alternative, one, what it would cost us compared to what we were doing, and two, how much we could save. Because you know, when you go in for a budget fight, you're going to have some budget numbers. And if you save money, if you in fact say, we can do this, and this biennium or this year, we do bienniums, so I'm sorry I get talking about bienniums, I know you guys do annuals. When you get to your budget, can you make savings in that budget? One of the reasons I didn't touch any of the penalties that's out there is how much that's going to save you next year. If you change penalties on the law, I guarantee it saves practically nothing. Unless somebody just doesn't get sent to prison, that's the only time. I mean, if you cut a penalty from 10 years to 8, is that going to affect you next year on your budget? No, not at all. So those are the kinds of things that I asked basically and said, okay, where can I have the biggest financial impact in the short term? And that's what you should definitely be asking yourself now, is where can those changes be? And I will tell you some that we looked at. One of them is parole. If you look into your parole divisions and how it's operating, how it works, do they have there some capabilities to do intermediate things? If somebody's starting to mess up, how do they revoke them back off parole back into the prison system? The second thing is look at your probation departments, how they're organized, how they're run, and specifically look at their operational things, because Mark's right. I mean, what do those technical revocations mean? Well, A lot of them, I suspect the judge is just absolutely fed up and that he's used every resource he had and feels he doesn't have any others. You might look at, well, what other resource do I need to have for those judges that they might make the decision, well, try again. Because, we know with drug offenders, particularly, that they will recidivate on their drugs. They'll go back and start using again and again sometimes, and just somewhere along the line, if you're successful, they'll break their habit, but you don't know when that's going to be, and sometimes it takes longer for some of them than others. That's part of the thing of why some of them end up sending them to prison, is they just don't feel they have the resources. Ask your people out there that are dealing with the system, well, if I did something different and I provided you some other resource, what would you do? And you'll find, surprisingly, that you'll get some real fine support from those people that are in your areas, such as your probation departments or your public schools or those other areas where you might be able, your DAs and your police forces might give you some absolutely spectacular ideas that you say, that's pretty smart, and it will save us at the state this much. It might cost me at the county or local that much, but if we figure out a way that we can cover their cost, give them the incentives, they'll be very happy to do that. So, we did that. We did a lot of work that basically asked those kinds of questions and found a lot of support from those guys.
Let me use this to throw in a question we had from somebody in the audience here, which is, do all drug courts save money? The way you describe what happened, Texas in 2007 was facing a $2 billion cost projection over the next 5 years for building new prisons. Instead of doing that, you did put in more drug courts, more probation officers, more residential treatment centers at a cost over your biennium of about $241 million, right? So it's sort of $2 billion or $241 million. That's the fraction you were talking about, right? About an eighth of what you would have spent otherwise. But I think there are enough people in this room, Senator Grant, Chairman Willard, Representative Neal, who, and certainly folks from the Department of Corrections who know very well about the dynamic in the criminal justice system called net widening, which is if you put out programs like this without some changes in statute, without some specific guidance about who goes into those programs, you may end up actually not saving money. You may end up with somebody who would have been on regular street probation, and the judge feels like, oh boy, now I've got a drug court, or I got a residential treatment center to put them in when they might not need it. So particularly for the folks in this audience, I think who are aware of those kind of dynamics, how has Texas been able to be successful with this? And when I say successful, I don't want to steal your thunder here, but it's not just that they did these things. Can you maybe even just say first what the results have been so far?
The results
your
have
population
been,
has,
in our prison population since then, we the dirty little secret guys, we built about 4,000 prison beds. We call them substance abuse treatment facilities. They're short-term, 6-month facilities for treatment, and then we put in some additional funding for aftercare, because you got to have that within your community. Otherwise, all the things you're going to do are just they're going to fall apart on you and won't work. The basic question was, do all drug courts save money? I would say that there is an absence of data that you will always have in this system, because we measure things on recidivism. Recidivism is defined as not returning within a period of time. Usually it's 3 years. Right? That's a hard set of data to get, and it's really hard to get from some of these individual drug courts and see how well they're working. I do not think that all drug courts save me money. I think that you've got to be digging and look specifically at each one of them and say, how is this working? Is this following the model, first of all? Not every one of them follows the proper model for what a drug court should be doing. So that's just part of the process you guys, that we get the opportunity to do. I don't say you guys because I do the same thing. You've got to look at their results to see if all of them are working. Some of them are costing you money. I suspect the vast majority of them are saving you money.
Well, and of course, a simple strategy is to the extent you have additional funding to give out for community corrections, is to tie that to those communities reducing the nonviolent the suitable candidates for those programs, reducing that pool that they're sending to prison over the previous year, and then you can kind of lock in your savings. I think that it is important to look at the criteria for who goes into a drug court. There are a few in Texas that take, for example, misdemeanor marijuana offenders, but the vast majority don't. I'm not saying a drug court couldn't be effective for some of those individuals, but since they're not eligible to go to prison in Texas for a misdemeanor, then when we're talking about spending state funds rather than county funds, I think policymakers understandably want to focus on the felony population. One of the best tools is a risk assessment, a risk and needs assessment. We released a paper on that because that can be used to match the offender with the appropriate program, so you don't over-supervise a low-risk offender. But on the other hand, for those high and medium-risk offenders, they get into the program that's needed to keep them from recidivating. So I would highly recommend looking at, there's the Ohio Risk Assessment Instrument that's public domain, it's free, that Dr. Latessa has put out that any corrections department in the country can use, and it has from pretrial to parole, different tools for each stage of the process.
Yeah, I would highly recommend, that's a major thing. I've been to some of the other states around that really said, we can't afford to do risk assessment. I will tell you one thing, you cannot afford not to do risk assessment in your populations. You have to do that. You need to do that with your people that are going into the first time they're in the court. You need to do it when they're placed on probation. You need to do it near the end of their probation. You need to do it if they're sent to prison initially when they come in. You need to do it before they leave. You need to put that information back to the community when they're going back, either on parole or direct release, so that the people know that they're coming. But risk assessment is vital and it's critical because you waste a lot of money on putting the wrong people into programs. I guarantee you that. I mean, I'll swear on a stack of Bibles that is happening in your state. I know it happens in mine. Do your risk assessment. There are 3 types of people I think we have in prison. I think you have the guys who will always come back, the guys who will never come back, and the guys who are in somewhat in the middle that says, well, depending on what you do and how you do it in your period of time that you have with them, whether or not they'll return. The guys who are always coming back, you have a lot of those people who are probably getting education programs. You have those people who may be taking up space in some of your treatment programs. If you did the right risk analysis, you'd say, that guy we don't waste a cent on that guy. We've got to pay for his room, board, and health care, and that's all you ought to pay for. The person who will never come back, okay, you waste a lot of money, and in fact, you may make them more likely to return if you put them in programs they shouldn't be in. So I would say to those people, with the exception of maybe technical skills and education, that you don't spend a cent on them. You save your money for that group that's in the middle that says, I want to make a smart utilization of my money. These are the people we can influence, and you determine that primarily with your risk assessment tools. That's where you find those. Same thing with your probation departments and the people going in, they want to put in the drug courts, et cetera. Do the analysis. There are some people that if they get arrested and popped on something, they are so pro-social that just stops them right there in their tracks. Right? There are others that need the kinds of programs that are there that are worked on, whether drug courts or mental health courts or other things else. So, it's a matter of being smart. And the smartest tool that you have is a good risk assessment tool. I'm not talking about one versus another. There are several out there, but there are a lot of them that will do you a lot of good.
Thank you. So just a quick comment to wrap up the Texas
You got a question
portion of this, but I think we're looking at about 10 minutes left, so then we have some questions here and we have some live ones as well. I just wanted to note that, remember in 2007 when this happened, the economy was still humming along, right? The economy did not turn south, so to speak, until really late summer, fall of 2008. So this was a case where Texas was not under the budget gun, but really made this decision to take a very different direction. And
we actually reduced our budget that we spent on criminal justice in the 2009 session. Not very much, but a little bit.
Right, and so what Texas has done is not only worked there. You've seen the flatlining instead of that increase of 17,000 prison beds. You've flatlined that growth as well as the cost. Your probation revocations are down.
Well, our crime rate's the lowest since 1973, so that's.
And that's I think the ultimate punchline, right? That this has happened despite all of the all the issues with the Mexican drug wars and the border, everything, your violent and property crime are down.
Yeah.
So it's what you all have done is just has been tremendously inspirational to folks across the country, because there's an assumption, right, that if Texas is going to do something like this, it's not going to be soft on
Adam,
crime.
do we have our pollster here to
Got
give us the Texas Tough slide? We'll do that one.
That's right. That's right. So there's some questions. There's one about privatization. There's one about the use of telemedicine and how does that help control costs. There's another question about how do you help offenders break their bad habits. We're not going to have a chance to get to these all. There's one, does Texas have sentencing guidelines? The answer to that is no.
No.
Texas sentencing system is awfully like Georgia's very indeterminate system with broad discretion, both the front
And by the way, in my
system and
visit
the back.
around in many of the states, that's probably a good place that we're in, both of us.
One that I might want to get you to hit on here quickly is about the barriers to reentry with respect to employment, housing, education, and the like. In addition, Family Foundation is inhibited. How should Georgia approach reform in this area?
Well, I mean, it certainly is a challenge when you have somebody coming out of prison. I don't know what y'all do here, but in Texas they get $50, and some of them actually end up coming out with women's clothes because there aren't any men's clothes to give them. But you know, so it's a good time of year to donate for that purpose. But I think that when we look at it, certainly, you know, our focus has been on removing government-imposed obstacles to a successful reentry, which include the occupational licensing I mentioned. You know, one of the areas that we are still researching is kind of the issue of housing, in terms of the fact that some landlords won't rent to ex-offenders because of fear of liability. So they've got no place to live. And in Texas, once you've been approved for parole, if you don't have a valid home plan, they won't release you, which makes sense. I mean, obviously living under a bridge is a recipe for going back into prison. So the housing is an issue. And in fact, one of the backlogs that Jerry fixed was we had people in prison who had been paroled there for up to 6 months. They'd been approved for parole, but because there was no halfway house space, they were sitting in prison at our expense for month after month. And we did fix that, thanks to you.
Yeah. Let me say that in all of this stuff, home is where most of them go. And where did they come from? Home, right? We send them back to where they came from. That's not always the right thing to be doing. So I would say to all of you, be careful on promoting, quote, family things. If they truly have, and you, as you do your evaluation, if they truly is a family that's there, that is a good support system, and some of them that are there have that, then that's fine. If there's, first of all, a lot of them have broken all ties with that family. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. There are others who basically their victims were their family. Where do the crimes occur that these people have done? Most of them are in that local community. Yeah, we had some great plotting of data. Data, again, it's important, guys. Look at where do you have your school dropouts at. Look at where you have your child protective service cases at. Look at where you have your drug deals that occur. And if you plotted them all on a map, I guarantee you there are certain sections of places in Georgia where that map will get very dark very fast. You have a lot of crossing of agencies that are out there. Look at how you can pull agency things together so that you do them smartly. Look at, for example, if you have a part of your county where most of the probationers are at, doesn't it make sense to have probation department locations within that part of the county? Because you require probationers to report periodically, you require people to be checked on. Isn't it smart to have it so that your people have less distance to travel, that maybe they don't lose their job because they have to report sometime during the workday for probation reporting, that you make some way that you handle that so that it makes it more convenient and less costly? Because both of those things, I would suggest you would be both. If you put the combined services that you might want to do someplace located within those community parts of your community where the problems are occurring. I heard from your Department of Corrections people that you have just opened a new headquarters and moved it closer to where the prisons are actually located in Georgia, since everything was Atlanta and South, and that's the situation. That's a good step, guys. I mean, that's smart. Put those things that are somewhat closer where they're at. So.
problem. I know we have a little bit of a backlog of some questions, so why don't we do some rapid fire from the mic with the concise question, if you could.
CPLI class. My question to you is, what's been the impact of illegal immigration on the solutions that you all have been implementing in terms of resources and dollars, time, and solutions implementation?
Well, it's one of the things I've gotten involved in nationally because that question was there. I've got in the prisons of Texas today roughly 11,700 of my 155,000 that I have now in prisons are what we call criminal aliens. Now, that does not mean they were all in the country illegally, but a large number of them probably were. All right, that cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of 197 to 200 million dollars a year. Okay, federal government for those prisoners gives us a total of $15 million, and your citizens are carrying the rest of them. I would advise a couple of things. First of all, I would never suggest to you that you send somebody to some other country who murdered, raped, or was a major drug dealer in your state, period. Wouldn't do that. You know, my conservative in me says if they committed a crime against a Texan, they're going to serve their time. We're going to make sure they get deported after they've served their time. And so there's questions that I think we all should be asking. I know Senator Grant down there, one of the things that we need to be asking the federal government, particularly ICE, when we turn people over to them from our prison systems, are they in fact being deported, and do you know that? Okay, I would ask your commissioner to say, do we have any ways to have them tell us, first of all, are you doing that? I suspect you probably are, just like we are. But do we know that they've gone? Or do we know that we're holding them someplace in the country in the federal lockups, which they might be, okay? But otherwise, they have a tendency to release people that you've arrested and turned over to them. They have a tendency to release them back into the community in some cases. And particularly, you'll get that from some of your local communities. Though, you know, there's some digging we've got to do. There's some coordination that needs to be done. But, you know, I looked at the populations there and the people I had in Texas, and I'm looking at just people that have passed their first parole date. I have 750 some Mexican citizens who have passed their probation, their initial parole review dates, that we still have there. And I'm not so sure that I, want to have half a ward or a full wing of one of my prisons that I'm paying for to keep people who's multiple DWIs. And maybe it's a wise idea for us to send them someplace else. I don't think we ought to release American citizens who are dangerous on our roads, but if we could send some of these other people to wherever they came from, it may make sense. I'm not sure to get them out of my prison population. So, that's the details you got to dig into.
Well, I'd also wanted to mention that we're looking at the people on probation who, felony probation, potentially, frankly, why pay to supervise them instead of just deporting them? Let me just also, before
and there are some of your cities, I suspect, in Georgia, just like there are in Texas, that don't check even their probationers.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I've got, since I didn't give my 50-slide PowerPoint, there are copies in the back.
Everybody can applaud that Marc didn't do that.
So, and then I know you have some handouts too, so just when everybody leaves.
The back left table over here. Yes, right.
I had the opportunity of meeting Jerry and Adam a couple of months ago at a meeting over in Alabama where they're considering this same procedure process. We're probably at a 2/3 level of recidivism in Georgia, which is way beyond what we need to be. And I work on the committee that deals with the budget appropriations, and I've seen the same from 05 just go up 35%, I think, in that period of time of 40. The point I want to make is that coming back, I brought a lot of literature. I've had an opportunity we were there with the Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, and I've come back, I've talked to Governor-elect Deal. He's very enthusiastic about looking at the changes that we need to make in our uncorrection or no correction system, which is probably a better term for it. And I think what you're going to see is a 2-year process. I'm just telling this for everybody who's here, the new elect House members and all, probably setting up a commission similar to what was done in South Carolina and going through a full study of where we are, what needs to be modified, bring in you people to help guide us on some ideas, and probably the second year looking at a form of legislation which will...
You can see, obviously, that mine was a 2-year process.
Yes.
that we started when I did in 2005, and it took...
But it's coming.
Yeah.
That's great.
Very encouraging.
Very
Time
good.
to do.
Did we have any more questions at all from the legislators or CFL?
Because there's a lot of opportunities that are out there, guys, and I certainly can't tell you what they are, but the ideas of your commission and the people that are digging into it and working on all sides, and, you know, make sure you've got, one of the great things I will say about my Texas Department of Corrections is once we changed the course, once we started doing things that said, put this programmatic things in there, do substance abuse treatment, make sure we have the mental health funding going in the right places, make sure we have the intermediate sanctions in our probation and parole departments, that they moved very logically and very intelligently in implementing those additional facilities, beds, costs that we had, and bringing those programs into the prisons in a very timely manner. Now, I will also suggest you make sure you monitor those programs real well, because there are times when the department will think they're just off to a great start, and you get in there and you find out that, well, half your people don't speak English, or they can't see the board when they're giving the classes, or whatever it is. You know, you got lots of implementation problems that you might have.
Well, thank you very much to Adam, Representative Madden, and Mark for their contribution. Again, they will hang around here for a little bit prior to lunch, I'm sure, and you can ask them some questions. A couple housekeeping things, if you would, with the session evaluation. If you fill those out, please take the time to do that and pass those to the center. We would greatly appreciate that. And then otherwise.